Welcome, everyone. My name is Heather Fry, and I'm with the Journal of Future Studies. And today we are going live with Dr. Timothy Dolan and Dr. Michael McAllum, and we're going to be talking about a reimagining of politics after the election of Trump. With the Journal of Future Studies. Dr. Timothy Dolan is a principal at Policy Foresight, which is a long-term public policy forecasting consultancy in Palm Desert. His doctoral dissertation was under Dr. James Dater at the University of Hawaii's Center for Future Studies, which is one of the only two such programs in the United States. He's taught at institutions of higher learning in the US and abroad, and he has also published scholarly research in the area of future studies. Dr. Michael McAllum is an internationally recognized speaker, author, and facilitator consultant. And as a microhistorian, his focus is on designing better futures as the world transitions from a mechanistic and centralized 20th century to a networked and collaborative society. Dr. McAllum is based in Melbourne, and he has worked with a broad spectrum of public and private sector organizations at the highest levels across Australia and Asia. He has led conversations on unthinkable change with senior managers from some of the world's best-known companies, and was a key architect of the New Zealand Foresight Project. Dr. McAllum is the chief steward of the Center for the Future Academy, which brings together transdisciplinary scholars from across the globe, some of the world's best-known companies, New Zealand Foresight, who are interested in narratives of the next social system. A director of the international consultancy Hames, McGregor and Partners, a foundation member of the Association of Professional Futurists, and a member of the Oxford Forum for the Future. He is also involved in ChorusSpace, a global strategic innovation platform that designs operations for entities whose value propositions are under threat. Well, thank you both for joining me today. It is my pleasure to have you. After those introductions, I feel incredibly honored to just be in your presence. So here we go. Though I would love it if you could let us know a little bit about what you have contributed to the reimagining politics after the election of Trump already. So just talk a little bit about your articles and give a little bit of an analysis or a diagnosis of this topic through the frame of your articles that you've already written for us. And Dr. Dolan, since alphabetically you are first, why don't you go?
Okay, thank you very much, Heather. And let me, I guess, begin with a little bit of a context in that I do have two articles that have come out specific to the election of Donald Trump, the election of 2016. And they're both variations, of course, on a single theme. One can make this analogy, and I happen to be within 5 miles of the San Andreas fault zone, and take that as my cue that the forces that have led to the election of Donald Trump have been building for quite some time. And then came the event. But those forces, I think, have been around for quite some time and have sort of been in the background and have now manifested themselves in this current administration. My take, having used causal layered analysis as a method for understanding and kind of unpacking within a larger historical frame this election, I found was a very useful tool for that purpose, in that I think it helps to, again, contextualize and provide a wider perspective for what, for many, was something completely surprising and somewhat out of the blue. Of course, as we all know, we have 20/20 hindsight. I don't think there were very many in our community that were calling a Trump presidency that likely, but here it is. So now we do have to understand how that was manifested and how that's manifested globally. I'll just make one more point on this, that, and I've long understood this, it actually goes back to my time working in the Vietnamese refugee camp in 1975, where I met the son of a 3-star general who was a refugee. I worked with him, and he talked about the Viet Cong as country bumpkins, as people who didn't even wear watches. They were so behind the times. And yet they took over the country, as we well know. And you can even go back to the 1949 Chinese Revolution and Mao Zedong, talking about the countryside of the world surrounding the cities of the world, and then taking over under his brand of Maoist socialism. So we've had echoes of this, I think, even contemporaneously, and now we're starting to see and maybe better appreciate this urban-rural divide, which has been long simmering, really from the beginning of industrialism, and now through industrialism into our post-industrialism, whatever embryonic forms we're now beginning to stand on the threshold of. I'm going to go ahead and just stop here because I don't want to hog the time.
Gallen's the chief steward at the center. Oh no, that was great. Thank you so much for that introduction, Dr. Dolan. Do you want to go ahead and jump in, Dr. McAllum?
Thank you, and Michael, please. Look, the first thing I need to say is that I clearly live outside the United States, and therefore I in making my comments, I want to be sensitive to really what is a highly attuned national sensitivity that I think that the US has. So for me, the election of Donald Trump is really one of a number of symptoms, however unwelcome, of a complete post-industrial system that's in decline. And Tim, I buy all of the things that you're talking about. I think that there are a number of reasons why this has occurred, and for me, they cohere as this kind of system issue. And what I tried to do was to say, how is it that we got there? And I think there are 4 things from my view that in fact drive the divisions, drive the tensions that have created this. And they are these. The first thing is that we are still trying to debate what are very complex problems inside the dialectic tradition, where we tend to put any answer along a spectrum. It's either this or that or somewhere in between. And I just think that that's totally insufficient. The second thing I think is, and here I'm echoing Zia Sada's work, we have a view of the world, particularly in the West, which says that efficiency and certainty and order are in fact the natural state of society, which I don't think was ever true. So I think it's one of the world's great myths. But for sure, in a world that's globally interconnected, what we're living in is complexity and contradiction, and of course, great uncertainty. And you might think that Donald Trump, in a way, is a walking symbol of uncertainty. The third view is, I think that I've tried to suggest in here, is that we have a bias that the system that we've got will continue forever. And I don't think that that's true. Other large social systems have come and gone. So my view is that the late stage, you might call it the third industrial revolution or whatever you would like to talk about it, a world based on fossil fuels, cheap electricity, mechanistic thinking has gone. And so we are now in the process of transition, which is a really good thing, because if we're going to transition, we need to come to terms with the damage that we are doing to spaceship Earth, and to realize that if we are to continue on this planet, we need to think about our view of how things are in a different kind of way. So for me, all of that comes together and is symbolized by Trump, by Brexit, by chaos in all kinds of constituencies. And the question really, I think, is whether people are up for a conversation about alternative possibility. Is that enough for a start?
Yeah, that's great. Dr. Dolan, you looked like you were going to give a little bit of a response.
Yeah, thank you, Heather. And I'm in great agreement. I will quibble. Let me throw a little nugget of potential controversy. I did read your article, and I know that you had the comment about dialectical thinking, which I have been a student of, actually. But I think what you're referencing is, and maybe it's just the nomenclature, really, that you're talking what I see as false dichotomies. And we have set up systems of false dichotomies, certainly within our political systems, where you have, particularly in the United States, where we have a so-called two-party system. It's really two loose coalitions. But that said, it's a Tweedledum, Tweedledee mindset, and that is indeed a false dichotomy. What I see as dialectical is not the two poles. You know, in public policy, I often comment that, you know, in public policy, there are always the two extremes. One is do nothing, and the other is kill them all. And our job as policy scientists, I'll speak for myself, is to come up with something in between, which is often indeterminate. And I'm interested in the spaces between the poles, because one side never really annihilates the other. No side ends up dominating completely. And so then you come into that uncertainty, almost a quantum situation, where you cannot predict, certainly can't predict what will ensue from those contradictions. And that part I certainly concur with. There are massive and multiple contradictions in our political systems that we really do need to sort through. And that's going to be, I think, a longer negotiation and certainly a longer conversation beyond this particular meeting. But specific to Trump, he throws into sharp relief, to me, the contradiction, particularly in terms of representing kind of this climatic phase of a 70-year-old's mind, frankly, a worldview that is passing on, but we have this climatic sort of a flame out, which is manifested in Donald Trump. And in some ways, he is the end movement of that song, if you will, use another analogy.
Yeah, look, in a way, I think that, and thank you for your comment. I mean, I love debating these things, but I'm a great student of a thing called analectics, which Enrique Dussel made popular in his liberation theology work, which comes out of, I think, the knowledge of the global South. In other words, so for me, Donald Trump represents a particular view, and yet Hillary Clinton, as she expressed things, was certainly a firmly committed neoliberal. So anything on that spectrum for me was actually quite unacceptable. What I'm much more interested in talking about is things that may be on completely different spectrums, things that may be that all possibilities are all true at the same time, or all possibilities are not true at the same time. And where I think that comes to a point of importance is in the way that we see our relationship with the planet. So typically what we do in the dialectic traditions, we go, we must save the planet, or we will just use it for our own benefit, or somewhere in between where the Paris Accord currently sits. In my view, neither of those two views is acceptable. because they have sitting underneath them a systemic view that we are the center of everything. And I think that is completely the wrong relationship with the planet. I think, in fact, we need to understand, having altered it in unimaginable and ways, in terms of our benefit, that is, how do we reconceive our relationship with the planet, which is a much more humble one, which doesn't put us at the center of everything the whole time. And I think that the kind of dialectic view that we have always relied on often doesn't get us to those questions. So I think there's a really interesting issue here that, and this is something that I know that Jose Ramos talks about a lot, that the knowledge systems that we have currently got are only part of the answer. And we need to learn to open up our knowledge systems so that they sit alongside all the other knowledge systems of the planet in order to find a whole range of possibilities that, in fact, in our Western rationalist tradition, we've just never talked about. And I think that this is going to be one of the great challenges for the post-Trump era, is will 3 years from now, and I'm sure some people are counting the days, will that time simply see another two proponents come up who in effect represent the same debate over and over again? And if that's the case, then it strikes me that the whole system will really struggle to make any kind of progress. So Tim, I think there's a really interesting debate to be had here. And by the way, I find it difficult because my entire tradition is dialectic. I love the rationalists. I love all of that stuff. And to try and learn to sit it alongside and be prepared to listen to other knowledge traditions, not as a judge, by the way, of those traditions, are they saying something useful, but with humility, I think is probably the greatest challenge for Western civilization right now.
Okay, very well said. I don't want to repeat myself. I will sort of comment lightly that moving forward, I do see the Trump administration basically going the way of revolutions everywhere. And I've been in a few, by the way. I've been in the Egyptian Arab Spring Revolution. I've been in the a coup d'etat in South Korea back in the late 70s. And so I've seen political upheavals. And of course, we've all witnessed revolutions of varying scales that have resulted in this euphoria, but only then resulting in a disappointment and another manifestation of contradictions, incompetence, and ultimately failure, even nostalgia for the old order. I think in the case, and we all are loath to do any kind of predicting, but I think in terms of the Trump administration, it's becoming pretty clear that the incompetence is already upon us, and that toxic element of it is going to drive new ways of thinking, as you phrase it, and it'll be interesting to see where those go. I'm not looking exclusively at the United States on this. I think it's a problem globally, and to some extent generationally. I mentioned within my article, graphically, if you were to ask somebody's of Donald Trump, let's say we'll just use him personally, to draw a map of the world, he would draw a political map of the world with each individual country with very definite borders, and its own special colors, and that would be his world. And in many ways, I believe he really thinks that. He thinks the world is a magnificent jigsaw puzzle, and he's apparently fine with that. Of course, any of us of the generation that witnessed the Apollo projects and such and saw the Earth from space, have a completely different worldview and understanding what the world is in a very literal way. So that part of it, I think, is going to be on the ascendancy once the Trump administration plays itself out. For the failure, I'm fairly confident it will prove to be.
Heather, look, it's up to you. I think we could keep talking, and I'm quite keen to talk about, well, what does transformational possibility look like? What
Absolutely.
can people do about this?
Right, absolutely. I think that's a good direction to go. I also wanted to maybe just take a few minutes before we go there we were talking, or you two were talking a bit about the of these two sides that you were talking about, the candidates representing. So I was wondering, before we move into maybe the transformational side, which I definitely want to get to, what do both of you see are the long-term patterns of change or these deep structures of which Trump is a symptom?
Sorry, Tim, you go.
I'll just take the lead on this one, just for the purpose of, as an American and being fairly well versed in the American political system. My degree is in political science. I've taught American government at every level, and I see the opportunity. Of course, from crisis comes opportunity. I see the opportunity with the Trump administration for some real reforms to come through. I don't know if it'll tip over into transformation, but as a practical matter, I think there will be a growing consensus that the system itself needs to change. It may need to change first and foremost with the Electoral College, which handed us an administration that was not a popular one. It's a minority government, yet there they are. So there's a contradiction in our democratic sensibilities. I think there may be, in my view, fairly immediately, real movement. Even former President Barack Obama is emphasizing this, that redistricting reform within the United States has to take place. And I realize that this is all nibbling around the edges of what you probably envision as a much larger transformation, but and hardly a solution. But I think in the short term, I'd say in the next 5 years, you're going to see that kind of thing going on, as well as, and this is my hope as well, and of course it's more hope than fact-based, but I think we will begin to reassess ourselves as community and maybe try to better negotiate or renegotiate this tension we have between a global system and a tribalized one. I think that's a system that needs to be addressed more broadly, and that may set the stage for real transformation. So that's all I'll say or comment on within an American governmental context. I know that you're ranging a little further, maybe transcending that particular scale.
I think this is the point where I say that over the years I've been through about 37 states, and I have come to know quite a lot of the US. And the kind of revolution I want to talk about is more of a social revolution rather than the political revolutions that Tim you referred to. And I understand, and by the way, completely agree with you around what happens in those revolutions. In my view, the revolution that really needs to take place is one that is systemic. It is unacceptable to continue a neoliberal experiment where the most wealthy people in the US have by far and away more money than anybody else, and that the tensions around that continue. So, and by the way, I think to resolve that system, you can't do it inside the current neoliberal model. So I am interested in post-capitalism, and I would make the point that post-capitalism is indeed post-capitalism and post-socialism. We need a different kind of economic order, I think, for the 21st century, and that's only beginning to emerge. Part of that, I think, will also be driven by the fact that artificial intelligence and robotics are destroying much of the kind of work models that we've come to know and rely on. And I think there's a whole revolution in what will be workers' meaning, what will new civics look like. This is the work that people like Michelle Bowens do. And of course, all of this needs to be done, and I keep saying it over and over again, within a completely different relationship with the planet. And somehow we have to effect this kind of revolution in our thinking, which is as profound as the one that occurred 100 years ago, when, after all, most of the world was ruled by empires. That revolution needs to occur within the next 2 decades. And if that is the case, you go, well, you know, that is an enormous thing. That is a rethinking of the world that the self lives in, what organizations look like in an age of blockchain and Ethereum, what new civics look like, what institutions have any kind of meaning at all. And I include nation states in that, and how they should be, and what are the kind of models. Now, I'm not pretending I've got all of the answers, but I think that there is a real urgency to, in fact, have completely different kinds of conversations than the ones that we have at the moment. And I think that the great tragedy will be if, given the strangeness of the current situations, and in my view, they're complete, the complete nonsense that they are, that we miss the opportunity to have these larger conversations. By the way, those answers won't just be large answers; they will be mid-size answers and mini answers, and all the rest of it. So that is for me the conversation that needs to be had. For futures thinkers, I think that this is a sobering time, and I'm not sure that much of the futures community, and Tim, I think you've put your finger on it, are really up for the kind of conversation I'm talking about. But all I would ask those futures thinkers to do is to think of the consequences if they don't. You know, what are the stories that will inspire, you know, the millions of young Nigerians who are under 20, or the millions of young Indians, or the millions of young Indo-Americans? You know, if we don't start to create these narratives shortly and empower these people, then the world for our children will be, I think, a very uncomfortable place.
Well, I would certainly agree, and I am in large agreement with your analysis. There are multiple contradictions, and it's, you know, we do well to understand that the nation-state system is an invention, as you well know. And because it's artificial, because it's an invention, it can be reinvented, it could be dismantled, and something can supplant it. I think we can all agree with that. It's, you know, it's long been my view, and I'm not original in saying this, that the nation-state system, well, I will say this, in my view, the nation-state system is a mediation between tribalization and globalization. But we also tend to view nations, and I love this term, they're a dialect with an army. They're usually formed around linguistic commonalities. And I've been around, literally around the world, and seen how nationalistic thinking is very fluid, very flexible, and in most places is in fact irrelevant, because at least in terms of national governments, they rarely hold any kind of significant authority beyond their capital cities. So, we have, I think we were both in agreement that that system is due for a reboot. And what direction it goes into will be, fairly fascinating. I'm a little concerned because, to use your term, the neoliberal model is sending us into a global system. And I've lived in resort areas most of my life. That's something else I need to mention. I'm literally a child of the Magic Kingdom, Anaheim, California, and have lived in Hawaii for quite a number of years and other areas that are, again, resort areas. So I've seen this nomadic corporate elite. I happen to be of an ethnic type that can go to resort areas and sit in the jacuzzis with these masters of the universe from Japan, from Germany, from Canada, from Australia, and find that they have more in common with each other than they do with the people in their own home countries. And so we have a layering, a global layer, this veneer of global elitism, which is at this point calling the shots. And is that where we're headed? I don't know how that's going to be dismantled unless it's done in a very ugly way, possibly in a smooth, clean way, because some of these people are actually pretty brilliant and they know the current system is unsustainable. So this remains to be seen. It'll be quite a drama either way.
I just want to jump in here because I've heard both of you talking about pathways of change. Dr. Dolan, I've heard more, you're talking about political pathways, talking about how the governments of the world are, constructs, and so that we can create them and recreate them. And Dr. McAllum, if I'm hearing you, I'm hearing that there's a lot of social constructs that need to be rethought and reconfigured. So I'm wondering if either of you are seeing viable pathways emerging, or if you're seeing ways of empowerment and change agencies or change agents that can have real influence over the long term. And if you could maybe talk to those for a little bit.
Sure. Maybe if I can start this, Tim. The first thing I would say is that the mechanistic model that has served us well in the 20th century and is the core to our organization design, I think is under considerable threat now. What I mean by that is I think that the networking technologies, the evolution of trusted third parties like Ethereum, in fact, are changing the transaction dynamics of what constitutes an organization. And so there is enormous chaos and confusion right now among traditional organizations as they strive to reorient to this new reality. The problem with that reorientation is that most of that means fewer people. And the question then for the large scale unemployment, underemployment, and that kind of thing is what kinds of forms then emerge. And as I say, and I'll emphasize this again, I think this is where the work of people like Michelle Bounds is particularly useful with his peer-to-peer commons. And so what I'm starting to see at all kinds of scales is the development of community-based activity where not every exchange is based on money, but in fact creates a wealth in the community that otherwise would not be there. And so I think that there's a real need to try and understand and encourage that. And for me, there are three criteria that are important. The first one is, I think if we are to transition to anything in the future, we need to be able to imagine it. So that is the role of narrative as imagination. The second point I think that's really important here is we have to considerably open up and make available the capacity to hope and aspire. My worry with the current situations is, particularly as many people can see the sheer injustice of the diversity, is that they have no hope, no ability to aspire. And somehow so that imagination and that aspiration need to come together so that we start to build a dialogue that anticipates a different kind of future. In the Centre for the Future, what we say this means is we need to understand what it means to be human in this century. In a century where, in fact, we have altered the planet to a point that people are talking about our activities as a collective humanity as having altered the planet at a geological level. That is an extraordinary statement. By the way, that among the science, that's now quite settled. And if that's the case, we really do need to have very different kinds of conversations. So when I start to look at these things, I'm not thinking about some kind of Trump, some kind of Hillary Clinton, or some sort of Bernie Sanders. What I'm looking for, I think, are voices that are non-traditional, that start to speak to people in ways that I don't think politics have done for a long time.
No,
and I think the Futures community have got a key role here. By the way, I was just in Oxford, and one of the things that was fascinating when I was there is because we had a number of designers and artists and those kinds of people in this conversation, and I think that many of those people are way ahead of futures thinking in terms of contemplating the possibilities I'm now talking about.
I want to jump in real quick before I let you answer, Dr. Dolan. Thank you, Dr. McAllum. We do have one question here from our viewers. It's a question from Mindy Yuri, and she has asked, what role can we as futurists play in supporting the sort of systemic change which is needed and perhaps already beginning? And I think, Dr. McAllum, you spoke a little bit to that right there at the end especially. But Dr. Dolan, did you want to jump in here real quick?
Yeah, I just have a couple of quick comments. One is going to be kind of an implicit critique of the futures community, or at least a certain segment of it. You got to be very careful about, it's such a diverse community. But we're very good about talking about. Not a lot of us are getting our hands dirty. A lot of us really get in and get into the communities that we're trying to transform. We often will stay in the classroom or write papers and articles about what could or should be done, but we may not really act in a direct way. And I think that might be, I don't want to make that an indictment of our community, of our profession, but I think we have to be a little more forthcoming and a little more active in the street, if you will. I see amazing examples of this. People who are putting together, community gardens and self-sufficient neighborhood activities that are quite hopeful. You also touched on this demographic dimension, which I think it's quite profound. That in my view, and this goes back to my dissertation work, where I advocated for national and community service, because I think we can all agree, the most dangerous creature on the planet is a young, unmarried Homo sapiens male. And from my dissertation worked a lot in developmental psychology. And it was clear to me that we have these developmental stages where at some point, this is specific to males, and unfortunately, it kind of genders out. We can have a larger discussion later, but males reach a point at which they need to go through a rite of passage. And if we don't have an institutionalized or a culturally sanctioned way to do that, they're going to make it up on their own. So they're going to join a cult. They're going to join a militia. They're going to join a gang. They're going to test limits of all sorts beyond the ability of social institutions to have any say in that. So, I think we need to address that. It's, to me, an area that we might want to give a little more attention to, because that's affecting, I think, everybody everywhere, particularly in nations with very large, young, robust populations where people are not seeing much hope.
Great. Sorry to cut you off. We're actually over time already. The time flew by, but I was wondering if maybe one of you could quickly, or both of you could quickly address Mandy's question. So what do you see action steps for the futures community? Or is this kind of, how would you address that question? Again, I'll read it to you. It's, what role can we as futurists play in supporting this sort of systemic change which is needed and perhaps already beginning? Or is this more of a wishful thinking that we have a direct answer to this?
Look, mine is, it strikes me that if we are moving into confusing times with systemic challenges, the worldviews that have got us to where we are now are not the worldviews that will get us to the future. So step one is to think about and to work on your own worldview. And by the way, I think that some of the things that Tim talked about in terms of who you connect with to try and reframe your consciousness, your way of thinking. By the way, when I talk about the worldview, that's your philosophy, that's your consciousness in terms of how you think of time, form, and space, and the ethics that actually manifest that. So I think for all of us futurists, just as we are saying every organization needs to reconceive itself, so too I think that the entire community of futures thinkers needs to have a very long look at itself at an elemental level and say, are we equipped to assist and work with people on these kinds of narratives, and what kind of consciousness do we have? And then I think it's, look, I'm in complete agreement with Tim here. It's then about working at multiple levels to try and understand whether the reframing we've been doing it actually works, and so to use that as a learning. So this reframing needs to be done in theory and practice at the same time. So in the jargon, that's called praxis, and that particularly needs to be sensitive to other knowledge systems, and that of course is always very threatening.
For sure, definitely. Well, thank you both for that. I think we answered the question as well as talked a little bit about your articles, and just had a really nice conversation about how we can reimagine politics given this new political frontier of Donald Trump.
Pardon me, can I just jump in really quick, because I don't want to leave my scathing critique of academics without softening it a bit, in that there is the role that we have to plant seeds. Mm. And so that's something, again, I think for those of us on that side, and I count myself as an academic, as a mere academic, that we need to keep that in mind. We need to have that responsibility to future rising generations, to prepare them for the worlds that they're going to live in and shape, and maybe counsel them on how.
Absolutely. I think that's a good point. Getting out of the classroom, but also taking that responsibility of shaping minds while in the classroom. So I think that's a good point, Dr. Dolan. Well, thank you so much, Dr. McAllum and Dr. Dolan, for joining me today. Again, my name is Heather Fry, and I'm with the Journal of Future Studies. And this was just a snippet of our 3-day 3 different sessions across the world time zones special symposium entitled Reimagining the Politics After the Election of Donald Trump. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Heather. Thank you, Tim.
Aloha.